Yeah. Oh, and I mean, Jason, that absolutely that, yeah, I have personal feelings and personal experience with that part. And I think we've talked before about the loss of my first husband. And that's exactly what happened with me. And that was really the catalyst for my interest in studying this behavior more, was the loss of that idea that when, we got married and we would have kids and this would be great and we would be together for 50 years, just like everybody around me. And then when he got sick and passed away, I was paralyzed uh, for definitely a period of time because I didn't understand really what it was that I was mourning. I I mean, the obvious, you're mourning your spouse has passed, and, at the time, I was only 32, and I did actually have a small child, but when I processed through that mourning process, I got stuck. I couldn't get, any momentum. I couldn't help myself get, um to the next phase where I was back being, focused on my child and raising her and all those things. I just was stuck.
That's Victoria Grady, a professor at George Mason University. This is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. I'm Jason Blair. Victoria Grady is a professor of management at George Mason University School of Business and an expert in organizational behavior. Victoria has studied how attachment theory relates to change in our lives and in the workplace. Following in the footsteps of the noted psychologists John Bowlby and Margaret Ainsworth, Victoria has conducted groundbreaking research into the impact of attachment styles on our lives and our willingness and our ability to go through change. Attachment, which relates to our relationships with our primary caregivers in childhood, has long been a cornerstone of the development of personality. I've known Victoria for more than a decade, and she is one of the most insightful minds when it comes to this kind of psychology. Victoria and I have spent more than a decade exploring and discussing attachment's impact on our adult lives. From her perspective, on its impact on the ability of people to change, and me, from my perspective, of the personality characteristics we can leverage to help people grow and adapt in their personal and professional lives. In April of this year, we spoke with leadership development and change management professionals in a presentation called Why Change is So Hard: Attachment, Personality, and the Architecture of Resistance. In addition to developing tools to assess organizational and individual change resistance, Victoria recently gave a TEDx talk called Staplers and Volleyballs that got me thinking about how it would make sense to revisit the topic of attachment since the first episode we did on the topic in 2023. Today, Victoria and I are going to discuss some of those things, revisit the topics, look at what we've sort of learned in the interim, and talk a little bit about the changes and transitions that we all struggle through and what we can do to make it a little easier for ourselves and others. Hey, Victoria, I just wanted to thank you for coming back on and joining me again. It's been a minute since you've been on the podcast. I think almost 3 years. You were one of the first guests. And, we just had an awesome conversation that time. It was wonderful recently to get together with you and do the webinar on why change is so hard. And then I was really excited to see you at TEDx. So just thank you for coming back on because I'm looking forward to kind of continuing the conversation and sort of continuing the learning from where we left off last time.
That's amazing, Jason. Thank you so much for having me back on. I have to share with you that your podcast was the very first one 3 years ago that I had ever done. So
Oh,
it pretty
really?
much, yeah. So it got me definitely taught me a lot and got me excited about doing more podcasts. So when you circle back and wanted to revisit some of the work and how it's evolved, I'm super excited to be here with you.
Yeah. And, we talked about this last time, but one of the things that I love about your work as somebody who is just, not a researcher, but a practitioner myself is it's amazing to see really good research. I love seeing it. It informs the work that I do, but and frankly, it informs the way that I live my life on a daily basis and deal with my family, all sorts of other things and my friends. But it's nice to see it turn into sort of have practical implications to turn into something that practically impacts people's lives. So I'm always excited to talk about how it's, you know, evolving. You know, one of the things I was thinking about in our recent conversation, we were talking in that conversation about attachment in general and talking about it as a safety strategy. And one of my firm beliefs is that, personality is not merely a temperament, but really it's really rooted in a set of strategies that we form really early on. And those strategies are what sort of helps us navigate the world and feel safe, manage our closeness with people. And then eventually that sort of becomes our operating code. And that's really our, personality. And, you know, it impacts us with our families, it impacts us with our relationships, it impacts us with our work. But I think sometimes we tend to think of personality as just merely who we are as opposed to how we operate and how we operate automatically. So I wanted to start just by asking you a little bit about the links between sort of attachment, our evolution, and how it became essentially the OS or operating system for us.
Jason, I think that's a really interesting question, and I love the discussion around personality and attachment behavior, like their intersection. I recognize that that's not what you ask, so I'll answer the question that you asked, but I do want to plug that as being something that is definitely at the forefront of my brain in terms of what the interplay looks like between attachment behavior and personality. So attachment behavior, as you know, is grounded in our instinct. It's a biological response that happens somewhere early on after birth when you recognize that you and whoever gave birth to you are no longer together. You no longer have that support system that you had as you developed initially. And we all migrate towards something in our environment that will give us that support that we are looking for. And it doesn't really matter what it is, it's just that you do it, right? And that you recognize that you sometimes need a little bit of extra support as you experience the world around you. That happens that first time, and it's you and I both know that it's so critical that it happened that first time. And in the gross majority of folks, it is an automatic. There's such a small percentage of folks it doesn't happen with. But that percentage is teeny, teeny, tiny in the grand scheme of the global population. And so as we recognize that we need that support, um, it once it happens the first time, it can happen again and again throughout our lives. And so maybe that very first time for my girls, I have two children and two girls, and I was very aware of their attachment. One of them attached to a doll, a small doll, stuffed doll. The other one, a blanket. And I didn't pick that. They picked it. It was just something in their environment that made them feel supported, taken care of. It gave them um, strength to be able to function in the world around them. What the interesting thing is that as they both grew, one of them grew away more quickly than the other from her object, and she traded it in for something new. And it was really interesting to watch both of them and kind of the process that they traded it in for something new. And we keep doing that throughout our lives. And I think
Mhm.
that is a piece of this that we don't understand. It's hard to when I talk to my MBA class about this, it's hard to conceive that this is a behavior from your infancy is relevant to how you behave in the workplace. And people look at me like I maybe have lost my mind when I say that. But you know, and I know that it's a really important part of how you function as an adult. Does that answer the question,
Oh,
Jason, of
yeah. Yeah,
beginning?
absolutely. And it's not, the interesting thing, it starts out as objects, but then as we get older, it can become other things. It can become relationships. It can be,
Absolutely.
it can be our future. It can be the way that we see things. And I don't know if I told you about this, but there was a very striking moment for me, a full circle moment. When my mom passed away 3 years ago, it was clear she was near her end, and she was becoming less and less responsive. The day before, she hadn't been, and the doctors had pretty much prepped us that it was probably going to be the next day. And so my
Mhm.
mom loved the quiche I made for her, which
Mm.
which is the same recipe that she used to make when I was a kid. And I don't
Mm.
know why I did this, Victoria. I'm in my apartment. I'm pulling my things together because I'm going in really early in the morning before visitors' hours start. And I run into one of my closets and I grab, without even thinking about it, my old Paddington bear
Mm.
from the point where I was a kid. And I took Paddington Bear to the hospital and laid it beside her. And, that had to be on the line of attachment objects, one of my early attachment objects. My mom had found it a couple years ago in some boxes and then returned it to me. And it was really interesting to see that in this moment of stress where
Mm.
I was losing my first attachment, which is my mom, I
Right.
went and grabbed like my second attachment and I brought it to her. And
Mhm.
that, to me, as somebody who is even, who has studied this, who's used this, to have that so automatically happen to me. Nary a thought was involved in it.
Mhm.
And, you mentioned the idea that these things become automatic. Can you
Mhm.
talk to me a little bit more about that?
Jason, I love that story. I'm so happy you hadn't shared it with me before. And wow, I mean, that it's so powerful. The power of this comes because it's part of our instinct, right? It's grounded in our biology. Our brains automatically look for things to provide us support in times of stress. And it is fascinating to me to see like how automatically it happens and even unconsciously. So I would dare say that when you walked to the closet to get the Paddington Bear, I would bet you weren't even really conscious of the
In fact, Victoria, there was nothing I needed in the closet.
yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, that's just yeah. I mean, I love that story. It's such a great example. And we as humans don't pause enough to recognize those objects that we just automatically tend towards that provide us with that support. I think awareness, Jason, is one of the most important components of the work that I've done in this space for 20 years is talking about things. And we were just mentioning um, before we got on the podcast about another individual who had, recognized wow, I haven't ever really thought about that. I mean, it's that moment when 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 you realize that there is a lot of different factors that are at play to create support for us as we interact in our daily environments, whether it's work or personal, whatever they are. Does that resonate, Jason?
Yeah, yeah, it does. I mean, eh, taking you back to that example of my mother, something you just said made me think of something that I never thought of. So when she passed away, I knew I would be sad. I was shocked by the level of loneliness. And
Mm,
I definitely found peace in my grief. But a really interesting thing about my journey there was that the turmoil for me really began before I even consciously realized that she was dying. And it was in the 2 years before. And I remember at one point post COVID, I had finally gone back to therapy after having not gone for a while. My therapist basically said, I'm doing her a disservice here, but she basically said, your mom's going to die, right? Um, and,
right.
it was probably the two most tumultuous years I've had in my life. And I wasn't consciously thinking about my mom dying. But in retrospect, I wonder whether some of that turmoil was because I had this person that I was attached to, this attachment object in the form of my mom, and it was slipping away. And that's the actual scary part. Because when my mom passed away, it became, in some ways, easier in the sense that I needed to find a new attachment or new attachments. And luckily, I'm surrounded by like 1,000 great moms. So it wasn't no replacements, but I had plenty of support. But I wonder if that part of what is most difficult about attachment is when you fear your attachment is slipping away or you feel it slipping away.
I think that's a really great question, Jason, and I think it makes me ask if there's even a pre-question to that in terms of, recognizing that you're attached to something. I think that's,
Yes.
really, yeah. Like I think a lot of folks don't realize the magnitude or the depth that we have to the objects in our environment. And and objects, I love that noted it could be a physical thing, like Paddington Bear, but it can also be a relationship. So it doesn't have to be tangible. You don't have to touch it. And I think that that is
I think
that
for a
part
lot
of
of
it.
people, it's a dream,
Yeah.
the dream
Yeah.
of their future. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and I mean, Jason, that absolutely that, yeah, yeah, I have personal feelings and personal experience with that part. And I think we've talked before about the loss of my first husband. And that's exactly what happened with me. And that was really the catalyst for my interest in studying this behavior more, was the loss of that idea that when, we got married and we would have kids and this would be great and we would be together for 50 years, just like everybody around me. And then when he got sick and passed away, I was paralyzed uh, for definitely a period of time because I didn't understand really what it was that I was mourning. I I mean, the obvious, you're mourning your spouse has passed, and, at the time, I was only 32, and I did actually have a small child, but when I processed through that mourning process, I got stuck. I couldn't get, any momentum. I couldn't help myself get, um, to the next phase where I was back being, focused on my child and raising her and all those things. I just was stuck. And it wasn't until I was in therapy too, just like you. I was in therapy and realized that it wasn't, I mean, I definitely was grieving him, but it was bigger than that. It was what he and I had dreamed that we would have together, and what I, just as a person growing up, had always thought being an adult, and I know you can't see me, but I'm quoting in the air, like what being an adult looked like. It just wasn't a death at that age, wasn't something that I had ever given thought to. And until I recognized the magnitude of, yes, I was attached to him, but even more, in addition to that, I was also just incredibly attached to the idea of what life would look like if you got an education, you got married, you had a child, like how it went forward. And losing it at that point was never something I had considered. And it took me, I mean, Jason, I didn't know you then, but it was, almost 2 years of me kind of spinning in a space of trying to figure out what it was that was prohibiting me from being able to, um, I like to say move forward rather than move on because, you never move on when you lose somebody. I'm sure you still feel that way
Yeah.
about your mom for sure, but move forward, like be able to put your feet one in front of the other again. Does that
Yeah.
resonate at all,
Oh,
Jason?
absolutely. Do you know, I don't know if you're familiar with her, but she's a children's book author, Judith Forrest. And she's written a number of really good children's books, but she wrote a non-children's book called Necessary Losses. And the way that it begins, it says, when we think of loss through death of people we love, but loss is far more encompassing theme in our life. For we
Mhm.
lose not only through death, but also by leaving and being left, by changing and letting go and moving on. And our losses include not only our separations and departures from those we love, but our conscious and unconscious losses of dreams, impossible expectations, illusions of freedom and power, illusions of safety, and the loss of our own younger self that I thought it would always be unwrinkled, invulnerable, and immortal. And, I always love that line, you know,
Mhm.
in part because, at least when it came to loss, it recognized that when we lose, and one, when we lose and we let go, that's where we can grow. But
Mhm.
when we lose something, it's not just the something in front of us that we're losing, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Yeah, what a beautiful passage that you just read. I mean, what an incredible, I mean, that's so profound. Acknowledging all the different pieces in our lives, all the different objects, all the different components, all the different relationships that can be support mechanisms or strength, as we call in the TED Talk that I did last fall, the strength anchors to help us be able to move to the next thing or to take on a new challenge. I mean, it really is, or even just put one foot in front of the other and, get up out of bed. So it can be something pretty simple.
I really enjoyed listening to that TED talk, because one of the things that you pointed out in there that these kinds of attachments can be found in anything, staplers, volleyball, like Tom Hanks, found in Wilson in the movie Castaway. I like to talk when I talk about the dark side of attachment about Gollum and the ring from Lord of Rings. He was attached to that
Mm,
ring. He was also attached to the
yes.
pursuit of the ring. Um, you know, like you were saying, it can be objects, it can be routines, it can be relationships, it can be anything. And I think what they all, and this, I think this goes back to what you were saying just a few moments ago. It's anything that restores our regulation, you
Mhm.
know, and that's what we sort of attach to and hold on to. And it's also when those things, and you made that really good point about the pre question, do we
Mhm.
even know that we're attached to something? Because if
Mhm.
it's true that life becomes hard, change becomes hard when attachment's threatened, but if we don't have that awareness that we're attached to something, it can be I imagine, an enormous challenge. I mean, if we don't even understand the concept of attachment, much less being attached to something, what do you think people can do in their own lives or to sort of build that awareness?
Mhm. Well, Jason, I think that is a great question. So don't laugh when I tell you. I'm gonna tell you a little story about how I do it in my MBA class. So my MBA classes, we start out the semester talking about perceptions and biases, uh, and mental models, things that we don't necessarily think are important, um, concepts to talk about in the context of organizational behavior. But the reality is they're really important, right? To understand those individuals before you can even think about looking at the team or looking at the organization as a whole. I mean, it definitely is a process. And so there's this fun little video on YouTube called the awareness test. And it's a video with, I don't know how many people in it, but there are two teams, a white team and a black team, and they are dressed and throwing a ball across. And at the beginning, it says, how many times does the team in white pass the ball? And so you have to count. But in the middle of the video, there's something else happening while you're watching how many times the team in white passes the ball. So you can't focus on the team in black passing the ball, and you're focused on the white. And then there's this thing moving through. Most people I've found don't see the object pushing through. I'm not going to tell what it is. So when your listeners pull it up on YouTube and they look at it, I won't have spoiled it for them. But anyway, they may be a little bit spoiled, but not totally. There's something that happens and it passes through the balls passing. And most people don't recognize it. And it's called the awareness test because at the end, it has a one liner that says, we often miss what we're not looking for. And so when
Mm,
people don't look for what they're attached, they don't know about attachment theory, they don't know how important attachment behavior is. When they're asked to look at how many times the team in white passes the ball, they totally focus on how many times the team in white passes the ball. I mean, it's fascinating, really.
yeah, and you know, but this is something that I've heard from people in conversations about attachment. We talked, I think you alluded to, there's a very small group of people, teeny tiny group of people, where that attachment does not happen at all early on.
Yeah.
But there's this bigger group of people because we associate attachment often with, let's say, our mother. And they have problematic childhoods and they have problematic lives, and they think they never really attach. And what I often find is they attach to something else. Um,
Mhm.
they did attach, but they attach to something else. Are there sort of like other sort of like for that group of people, are there other ways to sort of think about it or relate to it? Um, you know, in terms of a attachment? Because I think, you know, I think when you're we do have an attachment relationship with our primary caregivers, no matter how good they end up being in the end. And that really can shape the way that we attach to things in the future.
Mhm. It's r it is interesting, and I think, at the most basic level, being aware that we all have this biological instinct. One of the things that I think is really interesting, Jason, is the individual that is kind of the father, if you will, of this field of study. His name is John Bowlby, and,
I would say he should have won the new Nobel Prize. I don't know how that
Agreed.
happened. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, agreed. I mean, he's amazing, and he has, and I think this is an interesting fact. So it's not just people that, humans, let me say, that attach to object, that there are other living creatures. And he talks about it in his books, and it's a trilogy really, um, I think each one is 900 pages. So it's an enormous volume of work written around this type of behavior and observations of this type of behavior. And so I think that I think that the awareness is one of the most important parts of this, Jason, and having a basic understanding of what this is. And just to circle back for a second around personality, I think it's so interesting how well people know, or at least claim to know, what kind of personality they have or what characteristics of their personality um, are prominent.
I've always said people have a pretty good read on their personalities. It's the the challenge, I think, is, well, twofold. One, I think they don't always have a great awareness of how their personality impacts other people. And then I think we over
Mhm.
index and focus on the parts of our personality that we really like. So I
Mhm.
think those have always been the two challenges I've seen.
I think that's brilliant what you just said, and I don't disagree. But I think even more, like, why do we focus so much on personality and attachment is not something that is just as prominent? I mean, this is at least as important as personality in terms of the person that you are, right? And how you relate to the world around you. So it is stunning to me in some spaces that there isn't more discussion around this behavior and how important it is when we find ourselves in that space between, because we are, once we have that first attachment, like I said, we attach to different things throughout our lives, but we don't always have a perfect overlap between that attachment from the beginning and the next object. And so there's this, quirky space in between where we, kind of feel unsettled and insecure. And I think even knowing that that's normal and being in that space is another part of understanding the role of attachment behavior in our lives and how we, as adults in the workplace eventually are going to interact with each other. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. It does. It's interesting you make that point about how we don't really, I think, probably focus enough or as much on attachment as we do um, personality. And I think personality and even sort of like our motivations are sort of easier concepts sometimes to wrap our heads around. But I'm a firm believer in, and I come from the wonderful world of, clinical psychology, and I love it and I value it. And I definitely don't mean to diminish it, but really because it's had such a positive impact on so many individuals' lives and their quality of life. But if you really look at personality, or not personality, if you look at clinical psychology, it's really primarily about me, if that makes sense. It's really
Oh.
about
Mm.
me and my life. That the part of personality that's really relevant to other people, the rest of you, is the impact of my personality through my behaviors, right? And so if you look at us as human beings, you know, despite what people say about the opposable thumb, we would have all been taken off by lions and hyenas if we couldn't form effective teams. So it's really important to know, right, what my values are, what will bring me fulfillment, and then the way the rest of the team, humanity, really perceives me, because it's in that space between what will bring me fulfillment and the way I'm seen. Because everything we do in life, whether it's getting along, getting ahead, or finding meaning, is done with and through other people. So it's that space in between that I think is really important. And where attachment comes into play in my mind is, I think attachment is at the foundation of both our motivations slash values and our personalities. It shapes both of those things. It
Mhm.
drives both of those things. And I think that's really supported by a lot of fields. If you really look at things like attachment theory, evolutionary biology, really deep, good sociology, if you look at anthropology and you think of all these foundational things, all roads sort of point toward attachment's important role in our evolution as a species and our ability to work together and the formation of our personality and our values. And so I think in a way, it's really comfortable for people to deal with it on the surface. And what I would say the surface is behavior, right? We can
Mhm.
all look at behavior. But really, where does behavior come from? It comes from our life experiences, it comes from our motives, it comes from our personality. And where do our personality and our motives come from? Attachment. And I
Mhm.
think if you really look at it, almost like a disease model, right? That if my behaviors are a problem for me in life or they're a problem for other people in life, a great way to sort of like make adjustments in my behavior is to build self-awareness around my motives and my personality and take action. But if my personality and my motives are challenged, well, a really good way to sort of like work on those one layer deeper is to work on attachment. So that's kind of the way that I think about it. I think about it from the perspective of, okay, somebody could have cancer and we can treat the cancer, but wouldn't it be really cool to know what causes cancer so we can get
Mm.
ahead of it? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, yes, I do. I can't tell you I love the yes, your example. Yes. How many of my students come back to me later, and those are typically these are the students who really didn't buy into what I was talking about, or they were maybe only like half interested in this particular area, so they didn't grasp the magnitude. But once they go back out and feel that experience of, losing that attachment, being in that space and having that uncertainty, um, it's a very primal response for them to then come back and be like, wow, I had no previous recognition of the power that it has over me, just functioning in everyday life until I, understood this body of literature around attachment behavior. And those are some of my most favorite emails and phone calls that come, back up 10 years later. But because I agree with you, I think this is something that is part of our um as I talk about in the TED Talk, it's a basic instinct, right? It's part of our biology. It's not something that you can get rid of. You can't just wish this away. That doesn't happen. Now we have talked about that teeny tiny piece of the population who don't do this, but that is a a different scenario. Something that is definitely not part of our conversation today. Would you agree?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Now, it's a part of a totally separate conversation I have on the clinical
Right.
side of the house. But it's interesting you say with that group, that very small group that doesn't do it. Part of what we're doing in a clinical space, whether we know it or not, is helping them develop some of that artificially, right? Where
Yes.
it'll never be automatic for them, but we're sort of teaching them the value of it and how to sort of develop the functional benefits of it. And I was thinking as you were talking, you're right. Awareness is so sort of foundational to so many of these things, but I think also
Mhm.
understanding our attachments. And it made me think of something just going through my life. The moments that sort of stick out related to attachment were the sudden loss of attachment. I think of my
Mhm.
journalism career and the sudden loss of attachment. I think of my mom. I think of a few other moments in my life where there's been the sudden loss. Um,
Mhm.
and I think of that often in the context, like when I'm working with leaders.
Mhm.
And, inevitably in an organization, you're at a big organization, somebody has a plan to do a transformation or reorganization or some kind of change. I hope this isn't happening inside your family ever. And they don't tell anyone except for the inner circle because they're so nervous about it and they don't want competitors to know and they're worried how employees will react to it. And, they work on it for a long period of time. Then the group of people who know about different parts of it, but nobody gets the whole, find out more and more about it. But when it finally hits the full workplace, it feels like it came out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
And, one that we often talk about, it could be because I have 3,000 books, is that idea of like the bookshelf, right? The bookshelf in my office. And then, going into, I don't think I've mentioned this one to you, but going into COVID, and, I knew attachment theory, but how attached I was to certain things that were in my office that I no longer had once I went home. And if it's that hard for a bookshelf, when you're changing my entire job or you're moving me from one office location to another, it may feel less sudden for those who are making the decisions, but it's often shocking and sudden for the people who are experiencing it. You know where you run into this in a family? It's when, dad or mom get a new job and we tell the kids at the last minute that we're all moving. you know
Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I think the sudden loss of attachment is something that we should look out for when we can have impact on how people experience change, I guess.
Jason, I think that's really smart. And it's, in my brain, I'm reminded of a project that I worked on a few years ago, so pre-COVID, with a team of individuals in Vermont. And I talk about this a little bit in the TED Talk without referring exactly to the scenario. But what was so interesting is that this particular leader, and it was a small team, small-ish, 182 people, recognized that her people, when I say people, I'm talking about the team itself, the 182 folks that reported to her, were so attached, and she used the word when I talked to her at first is connected, but that's attachment, right?
To each
So
other.
connected.
Yeah.
Yeah, connected to each other, but even to her and to her perspective. One of the
Mm,
things that, yeah, it was pretty cool, and the mission and values that she had put forth that formed the culture, and what she heard as she started socializing the idea that I've been here, for 32 years. I'm ready to retire. I'm going. And the panic set in. She quickly pivoted to say, okay, 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 I hear you, but I recognize how you value your part in this bigger organization. So let's make the decisions about how we move forward together before I leave. I mean, she
Slick.
empowered them. Yeah,
Slick. Right.
right?
That's
It
really
was
slick.
brilliant. Yeah, and she empowered them without even realizing it, but she did because I was working with her. So she did realize it, but they didn't know what was happening. So it was like a beautiful Jedi mind trick. I don't know if you ever watched Star Wars, but
These are not the droids you're looking for.
yes. That's exactly. She did a beautiful Jedi mind trick that really made her teams, or her team, the members of the team feel confident and supported. And it was a pretty simple exercise that, I mean, who knows how that would have been um, received in the absence of that support mechanism that she gave them. But she knew enough about them to recognize when I asked the question, like how to create that. That's a skill, Jason. And that's definitely something that I love helping people try to understand more and dig into. If we leave, if a student leaves my MBA class without being able to at least tell me what they think they are connected to or supported by, I'm profoundly sad. I want to make sure we are spreading this science far and wide. And I think that goes a long way to recognition of this theory in the mainstream. What do you think?
Yeah, and I also think another key piece of that is,
Mhm.
building that awareness for yourself, but also the recognition that other people have attachments and they may not be the ones that you have. And sort of
Ooh, yeah.
uh, because I think it's easy if you're making decisions, and even if you can identify what you're attached to, and I don't think this is because people are selfish, but it's too easy, going back to your point about mental models before, to assume that people, just like we assume people have the same values, to assume people are attached to the same things that you are. And that's why I love the stapler example, because who would think it would be a stapler? But for some people, it's a stapler. I know one thing for me is my whiteboard that I have over there. I love that whiteboard. People make jokes about that whiteboard. People buy yarn for the whiteboard. But
That's hilarious.
yeah, there's a big red ball of yarn in front of me right now that was gotten by one of my colleagues. But I I I think recognizing that and then just thinking about what other people's, attachments are. I wanted to ask you about what I like to call the space in between. Sort
Mhm.
of that spot where we are attached to an object,
Mhm.
and then it's sort of the potential for loss is threatened. And,
Mhm.
it's not, we're not at the point where the change is actually happening itself, but it's that unresolved space
Mhm.
before, you know, the before there is resolution, where there's this significant psychological distress. Because I think when you've lost something, it is hard and you're mourning and you have to rebuild. But when you feel like something's slipping away, it's almost scarier. It's more likely to sort of provoke things like anxiety and panic. And, you know, in thinking about that, right? Like, when it feels like your reliable anchors could potentially disappear, one of the things that we've talked about is how you naturally, almost like a radar searching for something, you begin searching for a new object, and your nervous system, just like that radar, doesn't rest until it finds it. And one of the things I've always thought about is, if this is an automatic thing that happens to us, or at least as long as I've been thinking about these things, automatic thing that happens to us, how do we support people in that empty space that they have to go through, whether they're going to lose the object or not? How do we support people in that empty space and help them tolerate?
Mhm. Jason, I think that's a really, really good question. And I don't think that there is an easy answer for that, and the reason I don't think it's easy is kind of similar to something you said a little while ago when you noted that people don't attach to the same things, right? And people experience that space. D.W. Winnicott, who's another developmental psychology um, literature uh, seminal works, how all of his, work around play and reality. He calls it that transitional space, that space where you haven't, um, w- in my mind, reattached to an object yet. You're kind of floating, and that may not be the most perfect articulation of that space, but at least in my mind, that's where you are. I think that recognition that we all approach that space a little bit differently is like part number one. And it reminds me of another example that I actually do mention in the TED Talk as well, related to a publishing house in the UK that I got to do some work with, related to the transition from a small publishing house to being purchased by a large publishing house. And they were uh, all in that transitional space. And the owner, who had been the owner, he started it. It's a family-owned business that had been in existence for 60 or 70 years, and he had taken over from his father and was just ready to retire. And so when the other company came along to buy it, it was great because he was like, "Perfect, this is it." But he did realize that the folks inside the business that were working with him were struggling, and he again it was not something that in this situation that I was even part of. He just thought of this himself. He was watching his employees struggle. He was aware that there was a lot of angst and a lot of uncertainty that they were facing, and he wanted to provide them with a mechanism for support as they made the transition. And so for him, he had this massive art collection. And so he offered the individuals an opportunity to, take a piece of art that reminded them of the space, and it would hopefully help them. It's a bit more complicated than that, but we'll suffice it to say that it was that recognition that they needed the support that helped them make the transition. It was not necessarily the art that was the object itself for each
It
person.
was the actual act of recognizing it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, in coaching and working with leaders, coaching is not therapy, but I steal from therapy all the time. And you just made me think of something. So, often when, teams are struggling because of change and I'm working with a leader, I steal from, and I can't believe I didn't even realize, I steal from some attachment related interventions. And one of them is, the first move is to establish a secure base, right? You as the
Yeah.
therapist have to establish the secure base for the client where they sort of feel safe, where they're, you know, at that from that secure base where things are sort of consistent and predictable and emotionally safe, they can start to sort of explore their vulnerability, take, more emotional risks and things like that. And then the next step is, okay, let's address whatever relational ruptures exist, and let's promote repair, right? So
Mhm.
how do we then, once we have the secure base, start to fix things, and then ultimately it from there it becomes like, you know just like in therapy, building things like emotional regulation and like, tolerating distress. Once you get to that point, you're probably in a really, really good corrective place. And I
Mm,
wonder
mhm,
whether, like, maybe for leaders or, parents or whoever, establishing that first secure base is the first step.
mhm.
Then working on repair. I think we probably jump to repair before we give people a sense of security and let them find something to hold on to.
I think that's a pretty brilliant, space, Jason, and I think that, I've never seen anything related to, helping folks realize, that secure base is part of leadership development. I mean, you may have just hit on, um, another area that I think is really, really important, and that is, the process of leadership development and what constitutes, developing a leader. What skills do they need to have? And I think what you're talking about in terms of this piece of leadership development around being a secure base and even recognizing what that role is and how you help. Maybe you're not the only secure base. Maybe there are other ways that the
Hmm.
leader could create a different secure base if
Or
maybe.
more. Yeah. You can
Yeah.
amplify it and have multiple people. Yeah. Cause I sort of think, you know, the secure base, which gives the safety and consistency, the repair in dealing with a rupture, right? I think the easiest way to do that is through sort of like modeling resilient relationships and helping people build either some sense of resilience for some or ability to repair among others. Because we're not trying to get people to be people they're not. We're just really trying to help them. Then the emotional regulation piece, which really comes through insight, awareness, and then like self-management. And then you're able, like we were saying, you can sort of like correct the lens that people see
Mhm.
things through. Not to say that it was wrong before, but to get an alternate lens. And then it becomes all about skill building after that, like communication, connection, relationships. And I think there is sort of like a model, because I think we can steal from all of our fields, or at least the best from all of our fields. There's probably a model there for people that just hold on to, not just both in terms of like being able to help others, but also being able to think through what they need. Like, go
Mhm.
find that secure base, because there's a flip side of it, right? Which is, the other part of my clinical work really takes me to the dark side of attachment, addiction,
Mhm.
bad relationships,
Mhm.
other things that people are often gravitating toward. And when they think about it, it often happens when they are in that transitional period of
Mhm.
losing something else that they're attached to. Because I think that radar is just going to search and search and search. And if it doesn't find a good thing, it's going to find anything. And, I certainly know from my own life, I've had moments like that. And I wonder eh, I wonder whether, if we are not conscious and aware, because you see it in toxic cultures that weren't toxic, like for example, in a workplace, and then they became
Mhm.
toxic after some
Mhm.
kind of change. I wonder whether part of the challenge is like, you know, if people are not given something safe, healthy, secure, or at least a menu of options, there's the risk that they're going to attach to something very negative or harmful
Mhm.
to the rest of the group. Does
Oh,
that make sense?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I totally think that is, yes, I do. I think that is I think that is exactly correct, and I think that's, where folks get in a situation where, they don't understand why they're unhappy or why they're not appreciated or why they're underperforming. There's so many things where you can be in, one of those. I guess it's a space is a fine word, but it's almost, like a cyclone where you can't get off. You're in it and you don't even know why. You don't know how you got in there. You don't know why everything is so chaotic. Maybe that's the best way to say it. And more of a chaos situation. And I think that what you just said about a toxic environment can happen overnight and we don't even realize that's happening. And it's so interesting because Jason, I think there's so much happening as uh we being the proverbial we, people go back to the office and back to work and return to office and new policies on how we work. And, I think it's interesting watching different organizations navigate it differently because there are some that just say, oh, we got to come back, everybody back all at once. And there are others who say, oh, nope, we're going to do a hybrid. And I think it's really interesting because I'm not sure that folks are taking into account the way we transitioned through that space on March 13th, 2020, when we got sent home and, kind of how you got to that new
Yeah.
space and then how you're going to get back. Like we need to whatever the RTO policy is, doesn't really matter, or it's not what I'm focused on. What I'm focused on is that you recognize that changing that policy, you got to give folks a time to to transition back, whatever it is, right? And and
Right.
grace, really, I think, to transition back is so interesting because I don't think that is largely a factor in in new RTO policy is that transition space, that grace that you need to make that transition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, because when you think of the biggest complaints people have about return to work, it's a lot of it has to do with that like messy middle.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it
right.
does. Yeah, and it's real messy.
Well, I remember when we came back to the office, I forget how soon it was afterwards, but we had set a return to work date and everybody was going to come back 3 days a week. And this was pretty deep into COVID. It may have been like 2022.
Mhm.
And in the weeks, we're doing the normal communication about it and collecting feedback. And, we had in-person visit with the team in a park. And then we had a in-office visit where everybody could come around and we could, check things out and with all the safe distancing and the masks and measure your
Mm.
comfort and all that other stuff. And then I think a handful of people pulled me aside and said, I just don't think I'm ready, like some version of that,
Mm.
not speaking for the team, but for themselves. And, just listening to them and knowing how uncomfortable it would be, we put it off for another 6 months. And when we came back, there was nervousness, but less nervousness. I remember one of those people about 3 months after being back. And she was really dreading coming back to the office. And she's like, I am so glad to be back around people and back in the office. And I'm shocked. And I think some of that was just really being attuned to that space, right? Like we had a grand plan,
Yeah.
we had all these reasons, but there was something that this person needed that I didn't necessarily, it wouldn't have been me, but something told me they were in this messy middle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think this again, it goes back to what I was saying about leadership development, Jason, just to kind of wind it up because I know we're we're getting close to the end of our
We're
time.
close.
But I think that messy middle is a really important part in the leadership development process because I think a lot of times leaders have so many other priorities that take their attention away from the individuals. I think that that's a really important, conversation to be sure that we encourage. We being me as a research scientist in the space of organizational behavior, feel like it's an important area to urge folks to really explore and to dig in and make sure you as a leader wherever you are, in the thread of your organization, understand how attachment and connection and relatedness is a critical factor that should be, at the top of the list in terms of understanding who your people are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally does. I completely agree with that one. I think one of the beauties of this, it's so applicable far beyond um,
Yes.
work or leadership. It can be applicable. If you think about some of the things that we talked about today and you think about your kids, or you think about
Mhm.
your parents or your friends, it shows up all the time. I think it's a great place to wrap up. I wanted to give you a chance to, if you have any closing thoughts or if you want to share anything about where things are headed, that would be great.
Thank you so much, Jason. I think I'm really excited to continue to work on the assessments that you and I have talked about before that we're developing to help organizations really understand more about what the teams and people and individuals inside their organizations look like and how their attachment styles are important and how one attachment style relates to another. But I also think I'm really interested, and we've touched on this a little bit, in really digging into the relationship between attachment styles and personality and what that might look like in terms of a deeper understanding for folks inside the organizations, not just for leaders, but really for the organization as a whole, the individuals in the organization. I remember in The Office, you mentioned the stapler a couple of times, and that's where that reference comes from, that red swingline stapler that Milton has with him all the time. Milton, I don't think everyone's always curious why a red stapler. And I don't think it really matters that it's a red stapler, right? I just think that as long as Milton had that red stapler, he felt wherever they put him inside that office building, that he could still get his work done. He could still be productive and perform
Felt
like
safe.
needed to. Yeah, he felt safe. Yes, Jason. And I think that's the piece. That's kind of where I would like to leave it. That feeling of safety is so much more important in the world that we work in today, where change feels like it's happening at a pace that is almost unsustainable. That I think that would be my biggest takeaway, is making sure we put a punctuation mark on recognizing and embracing that need for safety and security and your object, whatever it might be, to give you the support to keep doing those work tasks like you need to do it.
Thank you for joining me and Victoria. If you'd like to join us for more discussions with me and other listeners, we can be found on most social media platforms, including a listener-run Facebook group called the Silver Linings Fireside Chat. For deeper conversations with our guests and live conversations with other listeners, you can also join us on our Patreon at www.patreon.com/The Silver Linings Handbook. I'm Jason Blair, and this is the Silver Linings Handbook podcast. We'll see you guys all again soon.